All right, folks, good afternoon. My name is Dustin Siggins, and today I'm here with Jeremy and Kate, and we are going to be talking about government contracting, DEI, and really just how to navigate the new reality of government contracting from a messaging, marketing, communications, and stakeholder engagement perspective. Jeremy, Kate, you want to introduce yourselves?
Okay, go first.
All right, sure. Hi, my name is Katie Helwig. I am president of a consulting firm called Red LLC, and I help small businesses primarily navigate the federal contracting process, kind of specializing in those who are newly awarded on the Oasis Plus GWAC.
And I'm Jeremy Tunis. I have spent the last quarter century, it's scary to say that, at the intersection of public affairs, PR, advocacy, issues and crisis management, executive communications, and coalition development. I've worked as a consultant to Fortune 500 companies. I've worked in-house at some of the largest PR firms, Edelman, Burson Marsteller, now Burson, Amazon, in a variety of different roles encompassing reputation, public policy, and media relations.
So in other words, you haven't done much in your career.
Haven't done much. My wife tells me I need to focus on actually finalizing what I want to be when I grow up, but sure. Some of us are still figuring it out as we go.
Well, you are the guy who does LinkedIn live videos while skiing, so there may be
That's also true. But
so,
only on the blues.
Right.
Not on the diamonds. That would be too difficult, right?
That makes sense. I've only been skiing in New Hampshire, so maybe other states are more difficult.
There you go.
Well, let's just jump right in here. In the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of corporate whiplash on values, value, and politics. It used to be that businesses were considered conservative. 10 years ago, on whether it was LGBT issues, ESG, and other matters, there became a shift from shareholders to stakeholders. The NBA had a lot of controversy. The NFL, Apple took a stance against on gay marriage and transgender matter in North Carolina, but was accused of hypocrisy because it was selling phones in Iran. And then we hit 2020, everything related to the pandemic, racial issues. DEI became a dominant force in corporations, internally and externally. And now we have the shift the other way. So from a macro perspective, there's been a lot of just whiplash within the corporate world. One of the things, Jeremy, you mentioned yesterday was that when we were doing this prep for this call, is that corporations need to have value and values, but they can't just be a wind dial that just completely goes with where everybody else is going by the day, because you will lose loyalty, whether it's internally and externally. Can you dive into that a little bit? And then Katie, pivot to you to discuss GovCon specifically.
Yeah, I think, we've seen over the last, I would say sort of, if you go back in recent politics, you think about like sort of the Obama presidency and sort of what themes and elements that brought on in terms of hope and diversity, not just because of the individual candidate then president. And then we had sort of the rise of the Tea Party, right? And then that was a big sort of political inflection point, right? And then we had other sort of tentpole moments that sort of redefined sort of our politics. You think about, the election of Donald Trump, and you think about the George Floyd and the post-George Floyd, and we think about sort of how different companies have defined their purpose. We think even back to like the Business Roundtable, circa 2010, 2011, about what the entire purpose of a corporation is. Is it just to serve its owners and shareholders, or does it have bigger responsibilities to society, employees, and other constituents, right? And so I think as we talk about it, as the politics over the last, let's call it, 8 to 10 years has become even more volatile, not just in terms of ideology, but identity and tribalism and, some of these big events that were brought on by the pandemic. as we're thinking about it, how are companies going to react in ways that are responsive to all its different constituents or stakeholders? You know, the people who work at the company, customers, clients, elected officials, regulators, people who buy advertising, you know, investors, whether that's a publicly traded company or a private company, right? And how do you balance all that? You're not going to make everyone happy, but how do you sort of stick to, for a lot of these companies, and you know, Katie, you'll talk about specifics, but like you're a company that's been in business for 50 or 80 years, and you have, you know, defined values and mission and purpose. And how do you stay true to that through really volatile times? And how do you put in communication practices and business practices that allow you to continue, you know, to make revenue, to make money, to keep the lights on, while also staying true and being responsive to your constituents? So I think that's something I'm seeing a lot of my clients struggle with, and something that's probably going to continue regardless of who is president in 4 years or 8 years or what majority is in Congress.
Sorry, I had to go on mute. One of my 5 children came in the offices without knocking. Thus the like not so subtle arm motion.
Okay.
So Katie, you know, one of the things when we were talking yesterday that you pointed out is that things are a little bit different in government contracting from the rest of the commercial market. Can you explain a little bit about how it's different? You mentioned compliance yesterday. And then also, you know, what's changed from 8A to the DEI requirements under Biden to now not anti-DEI, if you will, requirements under Trump. You can kind of spell that out a little bit.
Yeah, so unlike commercial sector, and I think you know, this is purely 100% government contractors, right? Not the companies that have both a commercial and a public sector, because their messaging has to hit both sides. But there's a lot of just pure government contractors, and they are at the whim of policy. They are at the whim of who's the president, what the Secretary of Defense says, what these executive orders do. It is a moment of, you know, salute smartly and move forward. So because there has been, and it's not just this administration and all administrations, there are mandates that are put in based on political agendas or goals for that particular presidency to achieve. And those goals come out in federal contracts as compliance issues. You must show, like for a large contract, you must show that you have subcontractors that have, you know, that 5% of them are women-owned small business and 5% of them are 8A or HubZone or SDVOSB. I just read a contract yesterday, a large one, that said, look, we're not going to tell you what your landscape should be, but we're saying in order to compete, 30% has to go in small business subcontracts. And you tell us how it's going to look. The compliance piece too is, you know, it was the reporting that spent a lot of time on a quarterly basis for businesses, large businesses, to prove that they are meeting their small business goals. So for the mandates and executive orders, some of that reporting that was not in statute has been eliminated to make it a little bit easier and streamlined for businesses to do their business. But I was just looking up before this call, the small business scorecards or goals for small business percentages haven't changed yet between 2024 and 2025. They're pretty consistent. And each agency can set their own goals based on the, you know, the statute goals that are set forth by Congress.
One of the reason we had the idea for the 3 of us to get together was because you put up a post, and I forget the exact topic. I meant to review it before we were chatting. I apologize. But I think you had said like changing 2 words or 3 words can make all the difference when trying to message, because again, as we'll discuss a little bit later, but Jeremy already mentioned, what if you have employees who are for, to use a broad brush, pro DEI, which you have to keep your bottom line. You have to get contracts. So can you talk a little bit about how you are talking to your clients? And we've talked about the big picture already. Let's talk about the messaging. Let's talk how companies are trying to show we have value and values, and balancing that bottom line with also the need to show that they aren't just being wind dials, to steal Jeremy's term.
Yeah, well, the 3 words, diversity, equity, inclusion,
Sure.
need to be changed.
Right.
They're actually leveraging AI to scrub contractors' websites and things and flagging them. This is probably the first time ever that you may not have gained points, but you can actually potentially lose points to be competitive in a government contract if you don't make these changes in your websites and proposals, etc. So, how do you change those words to still attract and retain quality employees where DEI or diversity is super important? It's important to the corporate goals too. So, you can keep the DEI and have them mean something else. They can be diversity in skill sets. They can be, the E can be for efficiency. The I can be, something else if you want to. We were talking this morning, Dustin, as like I kind of coined a different type of acronym, right? It's like, so I was thinking about it last night. So what if the acronym is SHARK? The S stands for we see you. The H is we hear you. We appreciate you. We recognize you, and we'll compensate you. As a kind of a way of getting to that piece, without putting the red flag of the words that are banned right now for government contracting or funding.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that might be a little controversial here.
You, Jeremy?
I know. I think when we start talking about banned words and scrubbing of websites, there are going to invariably be some companies, some contractors, I would say probably ones with, larger, contracts that would be kind of difficult to extricate from, multi-year, in some cases, multi-decade, that may decide, that they're willing to sort of stand up. And they're going to do it in different ways, right? They're going to say, we may not, we had the example of like Jackie Robinson was scrubbed from some sites, reference to the Enola Gay, which was the aircraft that dropped, the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, right? Being erased, right? And I think, companies are going to have to make decisions both in the short term, but they're also going to have to make decisions in the mid and long term about what they are going to be willing to accept or not accept, right? There may be companies that, because of their business model, may not be able to push back at all, right? They may be making more sort of slight changes, and they say, we're not going to pretend that something we focused on for the last decade or 2 decades or 3 decades just simply doesn't exist anymore. And then, where do you put that entire part of your website or corporate narrative or investment reports, right? Do you just like put it away, and then when circumstances change, you just put it right back up again?
Back out.
Yeah, and that type of behavior, you erase and scrub everything, and then you have to like redraw it again when you feel like it's safe to do so. I think that's going to be very it's going to be, company by company. And obviously some companies, and for example, the industry that I work in mostly, the healthcare industry, some have decided, particularly ones with like billions of dollars in like Medicaid, which is like really hard for the government to kind of extricate if you're a hospital, are saying, listen, this has been a part of our company, and because of the communities that we operate in, whether that's rural, whether that's urban, whether that is, historically marginalized communities, we're going to keep doing what we're doing and, sort of dare the powers that be to do something about it. And others are going to, like what Katie said, make more sort of subtle accommodations to being in the same sort of purpose and mindset, but using slightly different words that allow them the breathing room to sort of operate in the political moment. Because I will just say this and then I'll stop, but that I think the companies that are going to have the most success across administrations and across political moments are the ones that are adaptable to the current moment, but not so, pendulum swinging that they basically pretend they're something every 4 or 8 years, or when Congress goes from this party to another party. They're much more sort of even-keeled, subtle, and collaborative without sort of reinventing themselves and being a chameleon every couple of years.
So Jeremy, 100% agree. I think, and Dustin, I think we talked about this. It's, you have your messaging and you know what you want, your company's value, etc. But it's almost like the order of operations that can be rearranged based on the current administration. So for instance, you're a woman-owned small business, you said Jackie Robinson. So you're highlighting the achievement first, and you're describing the achievements, and then later on in the text, you may just, say he's a Black American first and what have you. Same with when you get a woman-owned small business set aside or a hub zone, we've always said, don't lead with that. Lead with your capabilities, what you're able to accomplish, what matters to you. And then if they're interested in that, that's just icing on the cake. So I think what we're seeing right now is an order of operations from a marketing perspective of what, it may be the same context, but just needs to be rearranged of what is the first headline.
Well, and Katie, along those lines, though, government contractors, as you pointed out, have a heavy compliance requirement that isn't present in the commercial market. Now, to push back a little bit, Jeremy, on what you said, 5 years ago, right? So Jeremy, you posted on LinkedIn maybe a month and a half ago that you believe some of the DEI pushback is a dog whistle. But 5 years ago, companies were being praised for being wind dials, for just completely shifting toward DEI, ESG, LGBTQ. And so some of these companies are not reversing. Target's not becoming Chick-fil-A, but they are pulling back on specific language. Or BlackRock, Larry Fink led that charge on ESG, and 2 years ago started pulling back a little bit. Is it the companies that are going to be more wind dial-y, if you will, in GovCon specifically, because they have to follow compliance? If you take some kind of big, strong stand, sure, your employees might applaud you, but you're going to lose the contracts and go out of business, and then they're not going to be happy either way. Is there a different messaging for the GovCon side than there is for a commercial company?
Yeah, I mean, I think the companies that lean in to their sort of purpose and mission, and the ones that, I don't want to say that they don't budge, because I think that all, companies, they need to operate in the world that exists, not necessarily the world that they want to exist, but they need to do so with some measure of backbone if they want to be seen as consistent, and a place that you said, you're executing upon your corporate purpose, whatever that may mean. So I think where, we've seen, Target, a Bud Light, some of the companies that, are sort of going from one thing to the other. And I agree with you. I mean, we see this is not something that is unique to the current presidential administration. We saw, some companies that, let's say, have a more conservative sort of worldview. I think of the Hobby Lobbies of the world, and I have a lot of respect in some ways that they were willing to put their reputation and their money where their mouth was, so to speak, and pushing back on what they saw as unfair sort of government mandates about how to run their private business, right?
If I can just add a little context to that, Jeremy, we're talking about the Hobby Lobby, the 2012 case Hobby Lobby filed against the Obama administration's requirement that companies are mandated to cover contraception and abortifacients. At the time, there were 19 approved by the FDA, and 5 were seen as abortion-inducing drugs and devices. So the founder, the ownership of Hobby Lobby said, we're happy to provide the 14 coverage for the 14 contraceptives, but we're opposed to covering the 5 abortifacients. That was the for-profit case. And then there was in 2014, the Supreme Court, and then the nonprofit case in 2016. So just context for viewers.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Hobby Lobby has a reputation of really operating their business under what they consider to be, you know, sort of conservative, religious, moral imperatives for the people who run that business. And I think, you know, I think of also, even though it's not analogous, I think of companies that really from their founding have had certain values. You think about companies like Patagonia, for example, and the work that they do on sourcing and fair labor standards and environmental standards, right? And so they've sort of been that from the beginning, right? And so I think a company like that, not that they're a government contractor, at least not that I know of, like it's going to be much harder for all their constituents, their employees, their investors, the people who shop at their stores, you know, for them to kind of wholesale abandon what a lot of people know of the brand. And it's the same thing, you know, with Hobby Lobby. I think where, you know, where Target and companies like that that are sort of, you know, less sort of specialty retailers, so to speak, right? You know, you can never as a company or even as a person be all things to all people. But you want to be, I think, for a company, you know, like Target, you want to be seen as like being responsive to the values of the constituents that are most important, but you want to do so in a way that doesn't sort of overly offend or repel people that may have different points of view.
But what about, again, I want to pivot to Katie here because we talked about commercial here for the last few minutes, but the focus is, you know, government contractors. Their most important constituency is Donald Trump right now, or Joe Biden 2 years ago. So Katie, you know, how do you feel that companies, you know, is it more important to focus on compliance and getting those contracts if it may be the expense of some sort of, you know, brand reputation with the wider world, because compliance and EOs and whatnot are such a big part of getting the contract in the first place? RFPs as opposed to a traditional marketing and branding strategy in some cases.
Yeah, I think the companies that survive this roller coaster, again, there's the getting the contract and then there's delivering on the contract. So let's focus on the delivering on the contract right now. They're there for a higher purpose. It is to help the mission. They understand the mission, they buy into the mission, they are there to support the mission. Yes, they make money doing it, but those that they, you know, they talk to and they hire, it's about the mission. And those companies that we're going to survive will always be mission focused. Will always be there to deliver on time, deliver on budget, and hopefully deliver, you know, great customer service. So that's the nuggets, like for any organization, right? But then you actually have to get the contract first. And that is playing the game. You know, a lot of contracts, the larger ones, they're called a scorecard, like highest technical rated scorecard. You get points based on whatever that RFP says. And before, you got points and you had to show your artifacts that you had a DEI program. You got points for your cybersecurity risk management plan. You get points for, you know, ISO, you know, standard management things. You get points for your past performance that you did well, etc. And those who want to get the contract, they know how to play that game and will adjust accordingly based on what is point worthy for the current administration.
What do you think, why was there not this kind of controversy in 2021 when these, as you said, these quarterly DEI requirements, I don't know if they were instituted that year, but in the last administration, why do you think they weren't as controversial as, you know, Trump's focus on getting rid of DEI in government contracting?
So it depends on what you read.
Fair enough. I guess because I'm on this weekly call with you and Mark and others, I'm hearing more about it. But it is obviously part of that federal, that would be why. Because they're letting employees go, and that ties to government contracting as a secondary effect. which wasn't
Right.
happening under Biden, outside of the military vaccine issue, which was not relevant in the same way. So
Yeah.
do you think this is more getting more attention because it's tied to the federal employment challenges that are going on?
Absolutely, because,
Okay.
for federal contracting, throughout, contracts came and went. They had base years, they had option years. At any point in time throughout a government contractor's history, the
Mhm.
government can say, we don't want that person anymore. That person, that position is being closed. And you salute smartly and say, okay, and you say, I'm sorry, Jeremy, you no longer work for our company because the
Mhm.
government says that's no longer a position that they're going to fund. They've canceled programs for convenience like they have now. And the contractor says, yes, you can't protest that. You can't go to court for that. You can't do any of
Oh,
those things.
I see.
We are at the whim of the government. Why it's so much now is because now it's the civilian workforce that it um, you know, uh, does have lobbyists, not lobbyists, what's the
Well,
word I'm
public
looking for?
sympathy, unions and
Yes,
other
yes,
things,
yes,
right? I see,
A civil protection board, et cetera.
exactly.
right.
But here's my question too, Katie, is my understanding though, in some cases, these contracts though, particularly ones like for like military and national security applications, may be like a decade long where the company is developing some sort of,
Good
product or
point.
something, right? And so while I guess it's possible to sort of extricate, it would be, even for the government, extremely difficult to do so in some cases, right?
Oh,
That's
100%. It has to go through Congress through the Appropriations Committee. For those and how they're going to appropriate their money that year. And if
Okay,
they cancel a 10-year, say you're in year 4 of a 10-year contract, you're going to get paid for what you accomplished. And
right.
the government works with that company to say, look, this is what you've done. They'll make accommodations for it. But the contract is canceled. Just like these Doge contracts, one day it's there, one
right.
day it's not. You're going to get paid for what you worked. And then now and now the contract is ended.
So let's get this conversation a little bit into higher gear then. It would sound like the best marketing and branding strategy is go where the contracts are. And if people want to complain about it, then, people want a paycheck at the end of the day. And everyone has to make compromises, whether they are going to work instead of working from home, or whether they, wear a tie versus not wearing a tie, or any number of other compromises. So why not, Jeremy, just put out a marketing and branding program and saying, we're going to become the best XYZ company, regardless of administration, because the mission of making missiles or IT or supply chain operations for X, Y, and Z programs comes first. Why not just
Yeah.
make that and
I
be
think
there?
there's for a lot of companies, there's a lot of value in doing so. And I think that thinking it's counterintuitive, but I actually think hopefully the most successful companies have sort of been doing that all along. And
Mhm.
what I'll say about that is this, is that I think some of the most skillful answers from CEOs and other leaders over the last, 8 to 10 years, when sort of needled by reporters about what they think of a particular sort of political issue. I recall, I worked for a time in-house at Amazon, and I recall, a difficult interview with a CNBC reporter and Andy Jassy soon after he ascended to the CEO role, and was kind of asking him to make commentary on a number of Biden administration policies. And he was very skillful in those answers. And he said there's a lot that the administration was doing that they were working with the administration on closely and agreed with.
Mhm.
And then the reporter said something about like, oh, well, what about, some of the labor controversies about people having a right to unionize? And he immediately pivoted and he said, of course, the federal law allows
Right.
folks the right to join a union, and Obviously, we feel like a direct relationship with our employees, and the reporter tried to go down a rabbit hole. And I think what Andy Jassy did very well, he said, listen, there's been, since we founded as a company, there has been, 5 or 6 presidential administrations. He said, we've worked with all of them. We're going to continue to find areas of common ground. But most importantly, we will be, the most customer-centric company, like we have been on day one. That's a big statement in Amazon, day one. We're going to continue meeting and exceeding our customers' needs. And any policies we think that help us fulfill that mission of being the most consumer, customer-centric company on earth, and being a place that our employees are proud to work, that's what we're going to continue to do. And we are a company focused on that. And, there's going to be policies where in this administration we are working closely. And there's going to be policies where we have respectful differences. And that's just how the world is today. And it's how it's going to be in the future. And so I think one thing I would just like to say is that companies that are doing good work for their customers, whether those are companies that work solely for the government, I'd say those companies that are doing it the best are likely to continue doing it the best, whether, someone with the ideology of Barack Obama is in office or Donald Trump or something in between, right? And that they don't become, basically, sycophants for any presidential administration. They're the ones who provide the best IT services. They're the ones who provide the best SaaS product for human resource management, or they make the best missiles or AI system to intercept from our enemies, right? I'm making this up as I go along. But what I'm saying is that they're going to do so in many different operating environments. And, I would hope that they don't have to scrub 80% of their websites every 2 to 4 years. And they can do so in a way that is palatable to their customers and their employees. Because in the government sector, obviously, and in every sector, you're only going to be able to deliver upon your mission if you have employees that are bought in. And those employees are going to have lots of different ideologies and political viewpoints, and they're going to have to, some of it they're going to have to check at the door. And some of it they may not be able to, and they're going to have to, companies are going to have to manage that.
What do you, go ahead, Kate, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, Jeremy, I will have to say, for government contractors, they have to scrub every year their websites for messaging. Because because they have to stay on top of where the money is being allocated. So when a budget and brief is announced, and where the money is going, what they're asking for, what the project is, what that administration or that commander, how they term, is it digital transformation? Is it this, or, whatever the terms are that's in budget and brief, you betcha that you change those terminology on a yearly basis based on where the money is going and where, you follow that money. You follow how they're saying it, what they're asking for, how they're asking for it, and then you adjust your marketing and your messaging accordingly.
And that has to do with what you're saying is sort of the contracting vehicles that company may be sort of going after. Is that right?
No, it's where so each year, the Department of Defense or government puts out a budget and brief. Each agency says, this is what our programs are. This is the money that we're asking for Congress to do. This is why we're asking for it. And these are the missions and, and how we're going to proceed. And within those terms, and then there's a strategic plan that you can read, etc. Sometimes it's for 2 years, sometimes it's for 5 years. But those are 2 reference documents that GovCon marketers really use to make sure that the messaging is in line with that particular agency, with that particular customer, with that particular administration.
So in other words, the scrubbing that we've talked about here or on some of the Friday calls is just maybe an accelerated or more extreme version of a regular practice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll give you, for instance, when cybersecurity became a thing, right, about 10 years ago, right, that they were talking about it. How many government contractors put the word secure solutions in their company name?
Sure, right.
Because
Yeah.
and where we are now, consulting is a bad word. How many companies, because they're focusing on the Deloittes and the this and that, and pure consulting seems like a waste. It's a Doge target. I know companies that I've worked with that if they have the word consulting in their company name, they have changed their name and taken the word consulting out.
One of the things, go ahead, Jeremy, go ahead.
No, I think, it's most of my sort of frame of reference and experience are, working with companies that are hybrid companies, the companies that are, companies that provide B2B service, but also provide B2C and also provide B2G, business to government, which is, I guess, the term I'm kind of making up right now. But, and I think, for me, when we think about brand consistency, when we think about brand values, when we think about a messaging architecture for a brand, I mean, I think, the data shows in most industries that, consistency, tenure, resilience, like people want to know that the company they're doing business with, has sort of, at least they're agile, but they're also timeless in terms of, what they provide, who they provide it to, and what the why is for why they exist, right? So I think for, for companies that operate only in the business to government, the B2G space, it's probably a different dynamic in terms of sort of how they describe the services they provide and what services they provide based upon, the work streams that they're trying to pursue.
Well, and that's a really good point, Jeremy, which gets us to another topic of conversation, because we focus heavily on GovCon exclusive companies here for the last 15 or 20 minutes, where it's a very different dynamic than what you and I are used to, Jeremy.
Yeah.
I have some familiarity because of a couple of clients for my firm. And because as I was joking around with Katie yesterday, I was a member of the Tower Club Tysons for 5.5 years. You become an expert on GovCon by osmosis if you spend enough time there. But one of the things here, I'm looking at our notes from yesterday, is one of the topics I've written just a blurb as part of a larger piece once on what about the government contractors who are in both spaces, right? Let's look at the Catholic Church, right? It's a nonprofit, and it gets contracts under a Biden administration that's controversial on the left because it's anti-abortion, it's pro-life. It got criticized very early in this administration because of its immigration policies. And so is it reasonable, in your opinion, Jeremy, for example, if a nonprofit or a for-profit that's in both worlds, B2G, which is not a term you made up, that's a common term in government contracting.
That's what I thought.
But they're in B2B or they're in B2G, and they say, we're not abandoning our values. One, we're going to provide the best service. And because we have not only the service mission side that Katie talked about, but we have the ethics. Trust us that we're going to be able to execute internally with the ethics that you want. One, but two, how do they do that in a way where, obviously they've now solved, say, the public messaging for the administration that doesn't want DEI. But then there's the internal messaging where some people just want combat. Some people are just, as you said, they can't park certain values at the door. Right. Is that do you think that's a legitimate argument from a messaging standpoint of we have these values, we're going to show them internally, so you can see them as an employee, as a contractor?
Yeah, I mean, I think internal communications in a lot of ways is always given short shrift, but in terms of the mid to long term, that is a crucial audience. And it's not just the people that are working there now, but it's the people who may work there in the future. And people sort of, I think they have, particularly employees and alumni, like they have certain values. right? And I think leaders, the best leaders are able to rally, their employees even during difficult times, right? It
Sure.
may be difficult times because of the sort of political zeitgeist, the sort of chaotic nature of some of the cuts that are happening right now with Doge or whatever. But there also may be industries that like go through a period of turmoil related to tariffs, like the auto
Right.
industry right now,
Right.
the toy industry right now. And I
Anything
think,
imports. Right.
the best leader is going to say, listen, we're in a moment right now that is a difficult one. It may be a difficult moment for most of you because we're having to make cutbacks, or bonuses are being cut, or there's a hiring freeze, but we're going to live to fight another day and continue delivering for our customers and our investors and the people and issues that we hold most dear as a company. But you're going to have to kind of you're going to have to understand that it's going to be a challenging time right now. And here's sort of our plan to make life as palatable as it is right now so that we can continue growing and have a company, right? So I think that happens in a lot of situations, right? That happened to a lot of industries during COVID, for example. You think
Right.
about the hospitality industry. You
Right.
think about,
The hospital industry. My wife's a nurse. She worked
exactly,
during
right.
COVID.
What, like, just
Mhm.
paradigm shifting for 6 months, a year, COVID's case longer than that, right?
Right.
We had a downturn, obviously, like, the mortgage and banking industry had a period where like everything froze, right? But, you have to know that certain companies are going to have to be able to keep people motivated. They're going to have to keep people engaged, and they're going to have to respond, at least internally, to concerns that folks are going to have for retention purposes.
I have nothing else to add. I agree. Communication is key.
So when it comes to that, Katie, again, a lot of government contractors seem to kind of ignore marketing and branding. And that's obviously common across businesses and nonprofits broadly. But in GovCon, it seems to be a focus that, well, if I just fill out the RFP, that's really all I need to do. Or I moved into the hub zone, and that gets me a 10% advantage. Or sure, really the person who founded this thing was a white guy, but we're having, his wife is the face, or something along those lines. So we don't really need to market. It's all about the RFP and meeting those compliance standards, Katie, that you talked about. Right now, if things are tight or things are uncertain, how do you tell a government contractor, hey, invest more in marketing and branding when you're not really sure what's happening, how it's going to impact you, or what to say?
Yeah, so why government contractors don't really invest in marketing when they first get there? Because a lot of them are leaving government and becoming a government contractor and reworking for a place that they know intimately. They know the customer, they know the mission, all of that. So that brand trust is already there. Marketing is
Okay.
about brand trust, right? But as you grow into new agencies, as you grow into new markets, that's where marketing kind of comes into play, that you have to have brand recognition. You have to bring, your expertise over here in the Army, and you're trying to sell the same or similar to the Navy. So that's why you have to market and to create that brand trust. Why marketing, I think, is imperative right now is, again, the scrubbing of the websites, the messaging. I think this is a interesting time where it's not about just your message resonating with the current trends. It's you might be penalized. And we've never seen that penalized before. You may be penalized if you still have DEI on your website. You may be penalized for as being not part of the administration, and that could be a fear-mongering statement, but it's a statement or a conversation a lot of government contractors are having.
Wasn't that, again, part of my ignorance here? Was that not true? Like if you did do a small business set aside or a certain percentage was minority or veteran owned businesses, wasn't there a similar requirement that you had to follow those compliance regulations? Or are you saying this is going one or two steps further?
This is going one or two steps further. Like one of the reasons why the compliance for Biden is, they always had small business goals, but the government really never took the measure to enforce those goals to large businesses to ensure. So there was always like, you just had to have a statement that you're going to do your best to. And
I
then,
see.
of course, that wasn't happening. So more compliance, more reporting happened to showcase that, no, it's not good enough. You're saying you're going to do your best effort. We want to see that you're doing it. So
Okay.
now we're kind of going back. It's like, well, we went too far on that side. We made reporting a huge headache. And, and that wasn't the intent. The intent was leverage small businesses. It's a win-win situation, et cetera, and move forward. But there are one of the executive orders on the DEI in particular said, we will take government contracts away if you do not do this.
Because you're not in compliance with the
Or if
standard.
you're not compliant with DEI, we will take it away. Industry associations, if you don't take it off your websites, you rely on government speakers, we will not
Fund their travel to your
we will
conference.
not fund the
because-
travel, they will not be
you're
allowed.
not
I
in
mean, it really
compliance.
that's the first time ever, to be honest with you,
Okay,
that it was retaliatory versus just compliance.
okay. So I see why there's so much concern then. Okay.
Yeah, and then the question is, what are companies going to do about it, right? I mean, are they going to sort of propagate it themselves, or are they going to sort of, I don't know the answer to this, but I would venture to say that, as things may become sort of more extreme, there's going to be some companies that, are going to not want to take it and are going to, I don't know under what legal theory, I don't know if it's even a formal legal case, or making public sort of hay out of it through communication tactics. We've seen this play out already with some law firms that have been, sort of targeted by the administration, or even individual companies that have made, statements. Some may have government contracts, some may not. Some may need to access government facilities, some may not. But, we've seen a lot of it, obviously, in terms of the civil service, individual employees or labor groups that represent them. But I do suspect that we are going to see, like we have with some of the law firms that were targeted, or obviously universities, which in some ways are government contractors of a type in that they receive significant funding and subsidies from government. We've seen that sort of pushback. Just as of last night, there was the president made a social media post about directing the IRS to revoke Harvard's nonprofit status. We'll see how that holds up, right? So I think we're going to see more of this, and individual organizations, based on their own sort of financial, legal values, they're going to be making decisions on how to sort of respond to this. And so is Congress, by the way. I mean, the next election, is in 20 some odd months, right? And if a new majority comes in the House or the Senate, they may attempt to sort of put their finger on the scale on these issues and government contracting and what the congressional statutes are. Maybe there'll be restrictions on sort of payback, if you will, or not. So I think this is, we're in like the second or third inning of seeing how, companies involved in government contracting, both direct, only with government, or ones that are a hybrid, thinking about healthcare or university, or even big, companies that sell products to the government. I mean, this is really going to be a new area, I think, of both communications and law and reputation management, and internal communications too.
And why marketing is so much more important than before. And because these are huge issues and they have to be addressed, and you need marketing professionals to massage that message.
Or just change the message. We haven't talked yet about silence. For all the talk we're doing about talking, sometimes silence is a very powerful tool. Again, not a government contract example, but Trader Joe's at the height of the racial controversies of 2020, there were petitions against major companies, and some college student put out a petition that got 120 signatures to try to get Trader Joe's to change their ethnic names of their food products. And they allegedly waffled on it briefly and then said, no, we're not going to change because our customers drive our decisions, not random petitions. But that was a rare example in 2020 of a company not immediately jumping on the DEI bandwagon. There was an Asian-owned marketing company, I think out of California, but I could be wrong. It was a small company. I'd never heard of them until after the Asian spa shooting in Georgia. They put out a statement in support of the Asian community. And they used the Black Lives Matter logo. It was yellow. And that created controversies for two reasons. Appropriating the Black Lives Matter logo and yellow being the old slur against Asians. So I went to their website the next day after they got national media attention. I don't think I saw a single word about their mission, goals, products, services, or case studies. It was, we're sorry we offended you so much. And I think you're going to see similarly, I think just the nature of business is the bottom line. I think you are going to see, Jeremy, I especially look for your pushback on this. If you have some, I think you will. I think we're going to see the majority of companies largely go along because they need that bottom line. And they understand that, I wrote an op-ed about this. Public opinion can be harsh, but it's often fleeting. At the end of the day, as much as conservatives push back against Target, over time, it kind of petered out. Chick-fil-A, there were mayors of major cities trying to stop Chick-fil-A from opening in their cities. And Chick-fil-A still ranks in the top 3 fast food restaurants in the country for profit per location.
Yeah, and I'll say as a relatively center to center left individual, my kids, vote for Chick-fil-A. Our local one is actually owned, by a franchisor who himself and his wife are, pretty progressive, right? So I do think you're onto something. I think I would answer this in 2 ways. I think sometimes silence is golden, but I think at other times silence speaks volumes and not in ways that are helpful, right?
Sure.
And I think it goes back to the brand's values, the brand's reputation, and what business is the brand in? What is the nexus between whatever sort of social issue, geopolitical issue that is happening that month, that week, that year, and your own sector or business? Like, obviously, if you're a healthcare company, whether that's a hospital or an insurance company or a mental health, company, and COVID is happening, yeah, you're going to pretty much have to have a whole narrative around that and a point of view and something that's interesting, right? But if you're a company that's like one of the largest landscaping companies, do you need to say something about the murder of George Floyd? Probably not, right? And then if you do say it, what nexus can you tie to it that's going to be helpful for one or more of your constituents, right? So I think in terms of crisis, silence is almost never golden because it's seen as guilt or acquiescence, right? Other times, to your point on Trader Joe's, they didn't want to go down that rabbit hole of sort of renaming things that were totally innocuous in their view, that weren't really going to change people's spending habits. And I think, generally boycotts in the short term, with few exceptions, don't really work because people buy services and products, based on their need. Now, obviously, there can be exceptions. Companies that, go really hard one way or another on a political ideology or give money.
Bud Light went completely against their core target purchaser.
That's exactly
one
right.
campaign.
Yeah, if Patagonia, for example, started, saying that they were going to discontinue buying, renewable energy credits or selling leather products, in their stores, that would be not a smart move given who their customers are, right? Right.
Sure.
If all of a sudden, a company that makes, you know, organic food stopped getting certified and bought products from
Yes.
mega concentrated animal feeding operations, right? I mean, there's certain, you know, I
Obvious
don't think,
ones, right.
you know, I own a Rivian, right? Like, I don't think Rivian is going to start making internal combustion engines, right? So I think there's certain things that are so intricately tied to your brand where you kind of like have to be consistent without losing a lot of, you know, a lot of people that care about doing business with you. But I think for most companies, particularly ones like, you know, I mean, I don't say this just as an alumni, but like people are like, I'm never doing business with Amazon again. Yeah,
Right.
that's going to be pretty difficult to achieve, no matter what your political ideology is, because start thinking about what that means, right? So that's kind of how I would answer that.
Now, we're at the end of our hour here, so something we've hinted at throughout this conversation, I'll turn to you, Katie, first, is we've talked about, you know, you said Katie, excuse me, doing sorry, my sister's name is Katie, and we often call her Kate, I apologize.
No problem.
The purpose and mission, right? Who your core target audience, we've talked about that. One of the things that I wrote in 2021 for my company site was about value versus values. And there was three components to it. One, political values, cultural values change. In 2024, at least half of states in the US had a constitutional amendment against gay marriage. 100 years ago, it was largely acceptable to be racist. And those values have obviously changed. Most Americans aren't Christian anymore, right? Those things have changed. Cultural and political values change. DEI just being the example that launched this conversation because of the changes from 2020 to 2020 throughout 2025 in some ways. But from if you want to talk to conservatives and talk about thought diversity, right? Or you know, every company has to be diverse. It can't just all be white guys from northern New Hampshire, and you can't just have all accountants. You can't just have all marketing people. So whether it's, you know, depending on the administration, obviously there might be different swings at that. You know, DEI requirements are a little more extreme, or you can't have any diversity mentioned is another extreme version of it. But for government contractors, Katie, and then Jeremy, I'll look for your opinion on the commercial side as well. I feel like being able to talk about that kind of diversity of we have obviously again, operational, HR, and accounting is a very diverse employee set. And we have universal values like paying people well, not cheating our customers, and having accountability and great customer service. Can those be values that are universal that also kind of supersede and are more resilient, to use Jeremy's word, than the political values of the day? It's again, especially in government contracting.
Yeah, so I'm going to do value of your company, right? And we talk about diversity. I think what government is, the words that they're using is innovation, which is kind of new thought, right? Differences in thought, and our competition is our adversaries. So if our adversaries are getting to the finish line before we are, we have to think like they do. We have to have the same, not the same skill sets, but enough of the skill sets that are different than what we're used to be able to compete, be able to combat. So, so we use innovation, we use lethality as a term. And again, it can be used as diversity too. I mean, it's understanding the entire landscape and what the cultures are and all that from our adversaries. To your question though, the values inside, and it's about attracting and retaining the employees that are going to meet the mission. And you do what you have to do to make someone want to come to work for you. And those are the policies, those are the values that you have to communicate and provide to do so.
Jeremy, same question to you, you know, the examples I gave.
I think I don't have an easy answer to that question. I mean, I think you're always going to have to balance the moment, the sort of the present moment, the business environment, the dynamic, with
Mhm.
the reality is that you need great people to deliver upon the services and products that your organization brings. And that notion of resiliency, right? And being agile enough to operate under what could be non-ideal circumstances over a long period of time, you know, in a way where you are being judged by and large on how well you deliver upon that customer promise, but you're
Sure.
doing so in ways that allow you to continue operating during situations, environments that, you know, require you to be agile and nimble. I hope that it's not, you know, a clean, easy answer. It's always the most awkward one, which is it depends. But I think that's kind of at the bottom line, how you have to go about your business.
Well, that makes sense to me. Well, this has been fun, and as always, I learned a few new acronyms, so I appreciate that, Katie. And everyone just feel free to comment. We'll try to stay on top of things in there. Jeremy, Katie, thank you very much, and I will give you both the last words here.
Thanks, everyone. Look forward to hearing from everyone on LinkedIn and following my content. And you know where to go if you ever need public affairs and crisis management support across industries.
And thanks for the diversity in conversation. In different opinions. I think that is so valuable, and appreciate having that opportunity, Dustin. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, take care, folks.